The Man Who Awoke by Laurence Manning. Book 4. The Individualists. Chapter 1. The Living Machines. At the establishment of Mianus there was holiday. Little Vard climbed to the top of the partition wall, and would have fallen had he not been found by some of the older children. Trogley, who was 20 years of age, had coolly taken possession of a living machine, and had set off to see the great wide world, a project he'd been impatiently awaiting for the past 6 months, to carry out at the first opportunity. So the responsibility of the household fell upon young Bork and the girl Farinda. In the year 20,000 AD this was a less difficult task than one might think. In the first place, food and drink were automatically produced by the living machines at the mere touch of a button. Control of temperature and humidity in the rooms was similarly arranged for by the almost indestructible atomic motors in the power room. There was little left except the education of the other children, and the Sound and Sight Library made this task a sinecure. "But where has Mianus gone?" Farinda asked Bork. "Surely you remember, in the history record we read last week about Winters, the man from the past?" "Yes, I do. He went to sleep 18,000 years ago and woke 3 times. He's to awaken again this year." "Exactly, and Mianus wants to bring him here to study and perhaps to breed from." "Oh, but they don't know where he's sleeping, do they?" "They know where the first city was located after the Exodus. He was buried beneath that city, somewhere." "But then, when will Mianus be back?" "Perhaps not for several days. We'd better look over the breeding racks this afternoon." The 2 young people walked slowly through the building, looking at each room, for there were some dozen children to be accounted for, and ended their saunter at a locked doorway, which they opened. Inside was a set of shelves on which rested huge glass jars. In 5 of the great containers were babies, all less than a year old. They were supported on cloth stretched taut between 2 rollers which turned slowly beneath them. Even as the 2 entered, a fine spray of warm water commenced to fall in each jar, for it was time for the bath. This was followed by the hiss of warm air jets, and, now dry, the infants began groping along the sides of the jars for the feeding tubes and commenced sucking nourishment from these very contentedly. One of the 5, however, did not react normally. Bork, frowning, seized a controlling lever that permitted him to move the tube about inside the jar. He succeeded in getting the end of the tube into the baby's mouth, but after a moment it spat the thing out again, and although no sound was audible outside the jar, it evidently was crying. "I can't imagine why Mianus keeps this one," the boy said calmly. "It's been abnormal in feeding ever since it came from the incubator." "No, I suppose he's had the trouble of raising it so far, and now wants to see what its reaction will be before he destroys it," responded Farinda. "After all, he only has 5 experiments underway just now." Bork grunted in reply and peered a moment through a glass peephole set in the wall of the incubator. Here a dozen bottles of various sizes could be seen filled with liquid, and in each a human embryo in progressive stages of development. "Everything seems all right here as usual. Let's go back to the library." But Farinda was staring at him with a peculiar expression. She shook her head obstinately. "You have been doing the things you want to do all day," she said. "Now I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm tired of having you around." Bork shrugged his shoulders indifferently and set off down the corridor, while the girl waited until he was out of sight, and then set off about her own affairs. For the child is father to the man, and even the child of this age found her own company preferable to any other at times. Mianus, 1,000 miles away, bull-necked and swarthy, was grinning cynically in front of a sign posted on the wall of an ancient ruin. His parted lips revealed the pink and white gum nails that had long since replaced human teeth. "Adults are warned that the man Winters is for my laboratory," he read aloud. "If Hargreave thinks I shall pay any attention to such nonsense, he must be mad," he exclaimed, and looked around him suddenly, for he'd heard a slight noise. A stranger he'd never seen before was seated in the midst of a huge and complicated structure, evidently capable of flight since it had arrived through the air. Mianus made a step to the side of his little airship, and the beings stood watching one another in silence. "And do you also want Winters?" asked Mianus savagely. "I wish to see him and examine him for a moment," replied a woman's voice. "And you?" "I want to try some experiments with him." "Oh, well, we may have to wait some time. His awakening is not known to the exact hour by any means." The great machine rose lightly into the air and settled down some 100 yards or more away, beside a group of low, stunted trees. Mianus grunted impatiently and set about exploring the ruins. The ancient walls were grey and weather-worn. Inside the decrepit buildings, accumulated dust and debris showed in all directions. But he had a full square mile of ground to cover, and presently the hopelessness of his search caused Mianus to pause and return to his vessel. Time enough, he thought, when Winters emerged into the sunlight. The ship Mianus had arrived in was perhaps 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, just high enough to sit upright in. In the tapered tail was storage space, and set in the roof were the 2 vacuum wheels that revolved at terrific speed and set up a continuous suction drawing the vessel upward. The atomic motor was insignificant in size, 6 inches square, but rated nearly 2,000 horsepower, and ran for a week on a few ounces of powdered rock. Mianus entered the cabin and sat impatiently in the pilot's seat, looking out at the ruined city through the observation ports. So it came about that Volendam found 2 people waiting when he arrived. He'd come straight from his breeding laboratory, intent upon securing the ancient Winters for his own purposes, which were not precisely conventional. There was a tank beside his laboratory, a huge affair, 200 yards long. In it swam queer, half-human things with gills. The glorious ambition of Volendam was to breed a race that could people the waters of the globe, even as ordinary humans peopled the land. To this end he wanted to experiment with embryos descended from Winters, whom he considered much nearer in blood to the original amphibians than any human material with which he'd yet been able to work. Volendam recognized the airship of a brother biologist and promptly dropped a bomb upon it. The explosion threw dust high into the air and tore a ragged hole in Mianus' vessel, but did not cripple it. In 5 seconds the 2 airships were circling each other high in the air, trying to bring heat rays to bear. So it happened that neither saw the approach of Hargreave. It was perhaps only natural that the biologists were chiefly interested in the advent of Winters. To a chemist or a physicist or a musician, he was merely a famous savage, strangely come alive from the dark ages of ancient history. To the biologist and breeder of humans, he was a new strain of blood, a prize worth fighting for. In this day and age, to desire was to seize, and the rights of others were the concern of others. There was a world for giants, for gods. Little men had no place or joy in it, if indeed they were ever permitted to be bred, or, by chance once bred, if they were allowed to reach adult stature. For breeders seldom released for the observation of others any humans who could be termed failures. Now Hargreave was the most ruthless and at the same time the most able of the experimental biologists. It was he who had bred Dagler, the curious genius who, at the age of 12, had designed the great fighting machine in which Hargreave ventured abroad. Nearly 1,000 feet high, it stood on 3 steel truss legs that could carry it over the ground at 150 yards at a stride under the impulse of its powerful atomic motors. In a steel palace at the top, Hargreave directed his machine, and, if he wished, ate and slept there in perfect security and comfort for weeks on end. Hargreave wanted Winters, both for breeding and, after that, for the operating table, so that he might thoroughly satisfy his curiosity as to the evolutionary changes produced by the last 20,000 years. He'd been here a week before, and after an hour's visit had posted his claim and departed. Now to his annoyance he observed 3 people at the ruined city, and he hastened his stride. In a lead-lined chamber 50 feet beneath the ruined city, the X-rays and ultraviolet lamps had been burning for 3 days now, and the wax-faced figure on the couch had been stirring once in a while. The medicine tube had pulsed twice with its measured flow of stimulants, and finally Winter's arm raised weakly and pushed it away from the mouth where it had rested for 50 centuries. He sighed and opened his eyes wearily. For half an hour he lay there quietly watching the ceiling. Then, with the light of reason once more glowing behind the grey eyes, he swung his feet to the floor and stood shakily. The 3 days of drugged sleep and the nourishing stimulants had worked their miracle in his wasted tissues. He felt his strength returning slowly as he procured clothes from the vacuum box and opened the door of his lead-lined chamber. Once more the old thrill of discovery ran through his veins. Up above were fresh scenes, new developments in the great epic of humanity, ready for him to study and puzzle over. 50 feet he climbed up the steps of fused glass and pulled the little lever that had been arranged for him by his long-dead friend Eric. Instantly a crack of light appeared and widened into a square opening through which he climbed slowly and laboriously. He stood in a small room floored with dust, and from mere instinctive caution walked over to the corner of the room and rested his foot on the floor to see the great open slab slip gently back into its place. He marvelled at the perfection of the fitting, tight after all these centuries, and idly drew his cloak over the dust to efface the marks. He found, to his surprise, that he could not then tell where the crack had been. Unsteadily he went into the next room and stood in that doorway, blinking at the strong sunshine and marvelling at the ruined and neglected appearance of this once new and thriving city. Once more, he reflected sadly, a new group of friends had come into his life and gone on to leave him mourning them thousands of years afterward. But more practical thoughts came to mind. Here was a long, deserted city. He had scant food and no means of transportation. He must set off immediately to find people who could supply this lack. He had watched this city being built and, of course, knew every street of it. So he had no hesitation about his course and set off along an avenue and turned into a great square. As he did so, he heard a great explosion in the air and turned, startled, to see low over the buildings on his right an Eiffel Tower on legs rushing towards 2 airships. Great coiled tentacles were half stretched out to seize them. The airships, he observed, were more intent on fighting each other than on warding off the attack. The steel structure seized one ship and threw it crashing to the ground. Not till then did the other hurl an explosive at the giant and begin circling around as if preparing to attack. Even as Winters gazed, mouth open beneath the unkempt hair that covered his face, the second airship came a little too close and was struck by the tip of one flailing tentacle and broken in half. As it fell out of sight, a terrific explosion sent up an enormous cloud of dust halfway to the giant's waist. But metals were wonderfully strong in those days of mechanical perfection. The first ship, battered and broken, was still capable of flight. It rose limpingly out of the dust cloud and made off westward, the gigantic machine after it in hot pursuit, for it moved slowly and at a low altitude, so as to suggest to Hargreave an easy capture. As a matter of fact, it was quite 10 minutes before a flailing metal tentacle sent it to the ground, where a great leg crushed it shapeless. Winters, in the meantime, cautiously approached the scene of recent combat and stood outside the area of buildings, gaping at a great hole in the ground. The dust had settled on the trees nearby, making them greyish-white. Not for a minute or two did he notice the woman in the great living machine. Her calm and peaceful face allayed his first fears, and he approached closer, while the woman studied Winters with great attention. Rods and wires and shining discs radiated from her seat. The machine spread around her for a dozen feet on either hand. Upon closer view, its terrific complexity was still more apparent. Here was a maze of meaningless apparatus to Winters. The woman nodded her head suddenly. "This puzzles you," she decided, as if thinking out loud. "Now why should it? What could be simpler? Compared to the same apparatus in your own time and country, it is a marvel of simplicity." "The same apparatus in my time?" "Yes, you called them cities," she explained, "and that is essentially what this is. You had many thousands of people in each city, it is true. I suppose you could not afford many cities. While we have a city for every inhabitant, but otherwise they are, I should imagine, much the same." Her listener was making distress signals, amazement written on every feature of his face. "How is this thing a city?" he asked. The stranger stared, then frowned. After a moment's silence, she smiled again and nodded her head. "Some of our research historians have held that you did not understand your own institutions," she said. "Most of us thought that was a rather far-fetched idea, but evidently it is perfectly true." She looked hard at Winters. "I find it remarkable to think upon." "What then is a city? A place for houses to collect people? Not at all. It is a machine, a complex thing, almost alive in the animal sense of the word. Power is radiated on copper nerves. Water travels through underground arteries. Food passes through the kitchens and is cooked and travels to the proper citizen needing sustenance. Telephone and television connect the separate units into a whole, even as nerves. This is a city in its broader aspect, is it not?" I suppose you could look at it that way," replied Winters. "And then the specialist services of a city. They're a millionfold. My own city is not the latest model, but," she glanced about with some pride, "I venture to say that not even under the brain were there so many conveniences at hand in a city. First comes a complete power, food, water, and sewage system. The food is all synthetic, of course, and a small reserve supply is stored in the unlikely event of machinery trouble. Clothes, writing materials, chemicals, and such are consumed from time to time, are provided in continuous supply by tiny factory units. Permanent articles are made quite indestructible. I have no wish that a button will not satisfy, and in addition my city can travel through the air, over the ground, or, if I should wish, even over the surface of the water." "But how is this possible? You press a button and then what?" "Really, how childish. You understand that from any raw material the automatic chemist produces any desired combination of elements." Winters nodded doubtfully. Something of this sort had been developed 5,000 years before, but not quite so sweeping in scope as he remembered. "Then what could be simpler? The intake feeds, sucks whatever material is in contact, water, air, earth, no matter, and the buttons control the nature of the finished product." "And the power?" asked Winters, in some confusion of mind. The woman stared. "Surely atomic motors are ancient enough in the world even for you," she said. There followed a moment's silence. "I'm a historian," she added, half to herself. "I imagined it might be interesting to see you, but I was mistaken." "But so am I a historian," put in Winters. She shook her head and smiled. "A historian is of value only as he can translate the past in terms of the present. You are history itself and must be explained by historians, but I am afraid we've overestimated the mental ability of you ancients." "And what do you do for company? I see you're all alone." The stranger stared, and her dark face flushed darker still. "Company? Are you sane? That is the greatest boon of all. A person can get off by him or herself and live in peace and comfort without being under the necessity of having other people around." But you don't like other people?" "I see that you do not know the rudiments of values in life. In your day you were compelled to go to other people for food, clothing, housing, and in fact everything you needed. Nowadays we don't have to do so. In your day you made it a fiction of preferring crowded streets. But such a liking is not natural to the human animal, and we have cast off that pretense." "Do you not have husbands and wives?" "Of course, such things are for the children. When we become adult, we leave childish pleasures and come out into the world." Winters puzzled over this a minute, and was startled when the great city machine suddenly lifted itself into the air and started away over the trees. He was still wondering when a great steel cable wrapped itself gently around his body and swung him, struggling, 1,000 feet into the air and set him down on a narrow platform at the very top of the structure. A door opened, and the metal tentacle gave him a push which sent him sprawling onto the floor inside. The door then clanged shut behind him. It was a few seconds before he recovered sufficiently to stand up and look around him. He was in a steel vault with a domed roof. The room was easily 40 feet from wall to wall and circular in shape. At the other end of the room a long couch ran for 20 feet beside the wall, next to which, staring wildly at him, were 3 women. He started to walk toward them when a heavy, snarling voice spoke from the ceiling. "Stay where you are, Winters." He looked up and observed at the very apex of the dome a sort of ventilator with a seat slung beneath it. In the seat sat a huge man, broad of girth, with huge shoulders and long arms. He was peering through the observation slits and muttering to himself. Suddenly he reached for a lever and pulled it back with one hand. There was a loud hiss and a droning hum of some motor starting up beneath Winter's feet. Then Hargreaves lowered himself, seat and all, on the end of a cable, for all the world like a spider on a line, and stood peering at Winters with keen eyes. His legs were short, and the great hands opened and closed convulsively. "So you have lived for thousands of years and come to look us over. What do you think of us? The ant comes to criticize the elephants." He laughed boomingly. "I do not understand what it's all about," replied Winters bravely. "I'm a scientist. I've come to spend a few days studying your civilization, and I find savagery instead. What will you do with me?" "First, of course, I want to use you for breeding. After that, I think I'll take a look at your insides in the name of science. Just now, however, you're a nuisance. I have to be half a world away by tomorrow to attend to some experiments. Now, I don't quite know what to do with you, Winters." "How do you know my name? It's the second time you've used it." "Nothing simpler. Your entire story is part of our racial history. It's written that you went to sleep 5,000 years ago, and we've been expecting you to awaken for the past month. But I've no more time to listen to your childish conversation. We are near the city of the Abgene, and I'll leave you there with him until I return. That should be safe enough." Chapter 2. The City of Mirrors. With a curt nod, he pressed a button and was lifted rapidly up to his seat under the dome. Winters felt the platform shake and roll beneath him as the huge structure made its way over the ground. After half an hour, the floor ceased its sickening lurching, and the steel door flew open. Winters gazed at it, fascinated, and there entered the cable-like tentacle. With a cry, he sprang away, but the steel coil whipped itself around him like lightning, and he was drawn out of the door and lowered giddily to the ground far beneath. He stood on a small slope, and before him rose the walls of a city. They were about 50 feet in height, and perhaps a quarter of a mile long, silver-grey with the sheen of some metal worked into a very stone of the structure. The tentacle had released him, but rested on the ground behind, as if to prevent his escape. He stood and puzzled what to do, when a huge booming roar came down to him from the skies. "Enter the city, Winters." There seemed no opening, however, so he hesitantly proceeded to walk along the side of the wall in the meadow grass that grew there. After he'd half circumnavigated the walls, he came upon a square-hewn archway. The metal tentacle, meanwhile, had kept pace with him, slipping over the ground like a huge snake. It moved up, forcing him toward the opening. The whole scene was so unutterably lonely and desolate that he shuddered and thought desperately of attempting escape, but finally stepped upon the threshold. Once more the great voice came to him from above. "Push open the door, Winters." He found it gave to his touch, and before him stretched an empty corridor. He stepped inside, and immediately the door banged shut behind him. It would not open again. He was a prisoner. With sweat starting on his forehead, Winters walked down the corridor and turned the corner. Then he stopped, breathless. Before him stretched, row on row, thousands of men in orderly lines. Each man was looking straight at him with a smile of welcome. But the startling fact was that Winters could not tell one of them apart. They were absolutely identical in dress and appearance. He cleared his throat nervously. "Who are you? What city is this?" he asked. 10,000 arms thrust out in a gesture, and they all answered in unison like a well-trained chorus. "Our name is Mankind." This was not precisely illuminating to poor Winters. He walked a step or two forward. More rows of men sprang into view, and not until then did he notice something. He was separated from the inhabitants of the city by glass walls. He put his hand out and touched one of them, and stared curiously at the figure behind it. There was something slightly unreal about the grotesque affair. Surely those sheets of glass could not be some kind of mirror. "Why are you all alike?" he ventured to ask. The images in the glassy corridors drew themselves up proudly. Their voices blended into one, a hoarse, heavy crowd mutter. "There can only be one perfect man. We are replicas of him. There are no inferiors in our city." Then, thought Winters, these are mirrors. But, and it struck him with sudden horror, the mirrors did not reflect himself, but only the citizens. Was he non-existent, a dream? Dim, mysterious corridors stretched in all directions under the clear white light, stretched to insanity. 10,000 eyes stared coldly at him, 10,000 lips opened, and 10,000 voices spoke. In our search for Utopia, we sought the one best type. We found it. All other types were suppressed. But there remained then only one man in the country, so these mirrors were invented. They reflect perfectly the shape and voice, and even the thought of the original, but nothing else will they reflect. We produced 10,000 citizens. We could have produced actual men by careful breeding, but what good would have resulted? They should all be identical with the original anyway, or else be less than perfect. They would all have looked, thought, and acted in the same way. Besides, there would have been a waste of food and labour. So we use the image instead of the reality. If more citizens are needed, we will build more mirrors. If there is overpopulation, we will remove some. But is one of you the original, then? Which one is he? The mirror men looked shocked. In unison, they spoke all together. He is not here. Perhaps he is behind the mirrors. Some of us have claimed to be he. Many of us have claimed that from time to time, but we do not believe any such. We know that we are made in his image, but we do not talk about him. Winters walked nervously down a corridor and then stopped again. What could be more fruitless than to go further into such a city? One thing, however, puzzled him. How is it, he asked, that you know my name and speak what must be to you archaic English? Your history, Winters, has been taught in the city of youth for centuries. Old English, as it was spoken in the days of your own youth, has been a popular study for the past 20 years in preparation for your return. The answer was in unison. 10,000 words and gestures were uttered in absolutely precise identity. Winter's body had not yet fully recovered from his long stay under the earth, and his nerves were becoming jumpy. "I must see the real man," he cried irritably. "The rest of you are phantoms. Let me out of this accursed place." He waved his arms wildly and turned to retrace his steps. But now it was hard to tell which corridor was glass and which real, and he bumped against a transparent wall and rebounded to another. Angrily, 10,000 men stepped forward, and in an agony of horror and dread he rushed at random from mirror to mirror, battering his body against unyielding glass when he least expected it, and finding his progress unobstructed just when he extended an exploratory hand. The city reeled about him as he fell to the floor. Everything became dark in his head, and he remembered no more. It must have been an hour later when he awoke and sat up dizzily. The mirage inhabitants had all vanished now, and the corridors were dimly lighted, so that it was possible for Winters to determine which was passage and which reflection. He rose to his feet and, feeling hungry, chewed some concentrated food tablets from his pocket as he wandered down the hallway. Which direction led to the door and which away from it, he couldn't tell. Had he reached the door, he knew it would be locked, but he wandered on in search of it as men will whose position is hopeless, and to whom activity offers at least the appearance of accomplishment. Step after step, hour after hour he wandered, turning and twisting among the corridors, now and again trying the glass walls to see if, perhaps, one might prove a door. In his belt, under the leather tunic, were a few simple tools, a saw, a file, and a small axe. In reckless desperation he pulled out the axe and sent it crashing into a great mirror. A cascade of broken glass fell at his feet. Winters stood gazing into a swiftly narrowing cabinet which turned downwards like the throat of a phonograph horn. A hole led through the floor level into blackness. Several stout cables led down the hole from 3 complicated-looking pieces of apparatus that had just been set behind the broken glass. Perhaps, Winters mused, he might climb down to whatever lay below by clinging to these cables. As he stood there, the lights flashed bright once more in the corridor, and all around him stood the thousands of reflected figures. "You have passed beneath the surface of existence," came the masked voice. "You have killed a citizen of our city." Winters, not knowing what might follow, entered the shallow cabinet and climbed down the throat of the opening. It was dark down there, and the shaft was a narrow one, but he'd scarcely descended a dozen feet before he touched ground beneath and felt himself free of the enclosing walls. A little light came down from above, and as his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, he perceived that he was in a huge cellar, extending into the murky darkness on all sides, and with supporting pillars set every 10 feet or so. Presently he thought he could make out a tiny crack of light far off to one side, and set off in that direction, cautiously feeling his way among the pillars. As he got close to the spot, there could be no longer any doubt. Light was coming through a crack in the wall. Stealthily he applied his eye to the opening and looked through. He could make out the far side of a room. The walls were of reddish brown, and a chair was set against it, and a strip of blue carpet was visible on the floor. As he stood there, he heard a voice inside the room speak, and a faint rumble in unison from overhead made Winters start violently. "Come up again, Winters. There's nothing but sorrow to be found behind the scenes of life." Here, then, lived the original. Winters was getting ready to withdraw in fear and trembling, when a shadow fell on the wall, and into his zone of sight passed a small, inoffensive-looking man. He paced nervously to and fro, wringing his hands. Winters could hear him mutter to himself, "Oh, he'll find me out. He'll find me and kill me. What should I do?" Winters laughed silently to himself as the full humour of his discovery came upon him. He spoke softly through the crack, and saw the little man start back, terror-stricken. "I mean you no harm. I'm a captive here, and if you help me escape, I will not touch you. Let me into your room." "How do I know you won't hurt me if I do?" "Why should I hurt you? If you don't let me in, I will break the wall." This last was pure bluff, for the wall was of stonework. Through the crack he could see the little man standing perplexed. He made a step towards Winters and then stopped. Winters thereupon drew his axe and struck the wall a few noisy blows. "Stop! Stop! I will let you in." Abruptly a square of light appeared in the wall beside him, and Winters passed through into the room. The two figures stood a moment eyeing each other, doubtfully. The little man licked his lips nervously. "So you are Winters, but how terribly different from a man you look. Almost like an animal. You have teeth, and your skin is white like the belly of a fish, not like a brown human face at all." And as if these differences made him somehow superior, he drew himself up proudly and disdainfully. Winters laughed. Cautiously he looked about the room, but except for one end it was in no way unusual. At the far end of the room, however, were set 2 motors. A maze of wires led into 3 complex mechanisms set at about eye level on the wall. The man himself was perhaps 5.5 feet in height and quite slight in build. His dark face rose to an enormous intellectual forehead, but the eyes held a weird expression and the mouth was nervously twisted to one side. "Why do you live here, and what purpose do these mirrors serve, up above?" At the question all the stiffness seemed to go out of the man's backbone, and he became once more the cringing figure he had been. "I am Hargreaves' captive. Many years ago he put me here, and he gave me these mirrors to amuse me," he said. "But you, of course, are his captive as well." "I suppose so," said Winters, "but I don't propose to remain so." The dark eyes peered at him quickly. "But if you escaped, where would you go?" "You know my history?" The man nodded. "Well, then, if I escaped, I should get back to my city and down into my lead-lined chamber, far beneath the earth. Hargrave would never find me, and when I awoke again, he would have been dead and buried for thousands of years." A sudden thought seemed to strike his host like a blow. "But then, so could I." Sudden hope lit the drawn face. "Escape? Is it possible?" At last. "It would be a simple matter to get out of here," he continued, "for I solved the problem years ago. I've dug a tunnel under the city wall that needs only a strong push to open through the clumps of bushes on the slope outside, but I never dared use it. Hargrave visits me once in a while." He stopped, shuddering. "Hargrave will not return for several days," said Winters. "Then, yes, we will do it." The little man seemed to be nerving himself up to a pitch of enthusiasm. "We must rest ourselves and make all preparations, and then, out we go, and away as fast as we can." "Good. What's your name?" "I am Bengue. Years ago," he drew himself up to his full height, "my name was not unknown in the world as a biologist. I bred men of genius, and one of them was Hargrave. I was proud of him at first, but I'd made him ruthless and purposeful. Before he was 18, I'd lost all control over him. He went off into the world. You see, Winters, I am not normal altogether. I liked a certain amount of company. To be entirely alone makes me nervous, and you've seen me after 12 years of loneliness. I am not always sane. He stopped and stared broodingly at the floor. Hargreave came back to me after a year's absence, and we had words. He was a true individualist, as is most of the world today, and I am an abgene in that respect. If I had not been the scientist that bred him, he would have destroyed me on the spot, all over a passing difference of opinion during a conversation. As it was, he brought me here and built this city. The mirrors are supposed to make me feel that I have plenty of company. His voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I do feel that way about them. I merely ventured to regret the modern tendency to live alone and without any human intercourse. I believe I said that an occasional exchange of ideas would benefit everyone concerned. There was a short, bitter laugh. As I bred Hargreave, so is he. Great intelligence, but greater willpower. He took my words as a criticism of his actions, and so they were. But you are hungry, perhaps. Benguet went over to the mechanical end of the room and drew from a closed chamber 2 pieces of whitish food which he and Winters ate. It was almost identical with the ambrosia Winters had tasted 5,000 years before, that food which the science of that day had pronounced the perfect sustenance for the human animal. It was delicious. The broad couch which Benguet then offered him proved soft and luxurious. Winters was asleep in 10 seconds. He awoke many hours later in the grip of a vivid nightmare and sat up dripping with sweat. Benguet had heard him wake and had turned on a light to see what was the matter. It will be dawn in another half hour. I have not seen dawn now for many years. Since we are wide awake, we may as well start upon our escape. His eyes were shining with excitement, and his cheeks flushed. Accordingly, they filled their pockets with large cakes of the artificial food, and Benguet took a small electric torch from a shelf and led the way into the dark cellar full of pillars. They proceeded along the wall for 100 yards, and then the light flashed upon a black hole in the masonry. Into this he led the way, and on hands and knees the 2 fugitives travelled 100 feet of tunnel, Winters in the rear. At last Benguet stopped and made room for Winters beside him. "Here we are," he said. "Feel these roots overhead. All we have to do is push them up, and we're free." Together they set their backs to the task. After a breathless minute their heads and shoulders emerged together at the top of the short slope leading down to the walls of the mirror city. It was still dark, but the stars were pale in the sky, and over to the east a hint of yellow gilded a vapory cloud bank. It seemed cool. Winters shivered involuntarily. "Where now?" he panted, as they struggled up to the surface of the ground. "The city of the Exodus lies about 20 miles due north of here. We have no means of getting there except by walking." Winters grunted. It should be possible to make it by nightfall, he thought. They set off across country, keeping as much as possible under the shelter of the semi-tropical woods. After the first half hour, this semi-jungle became broken irregularly by open glades, and in the second glade they came to rested one of the great living machines. It was just beginning to grow light as the sun's rays touched the very tops of the trees. Cautiously they skirted the opening and plunged on among the low growth of greenery. Uphill now. At the end of the second hour they'd covered perhaps 6 miles, and paused at the top of a hill to rest a moment. Winters lay flat on his back while Benguet moved nervously about, peering through some branches at the country behind and below them. Suddenly, Winters heard his companion utter a sharp exclamation, and he sat up to see what was happening. On the horizon to the south, he made out the great skeleton figure of Hargreave, striding along, outlined against the sky. The high-handed action of Hargreave in laying claim to Winters had not been taken tamely by the biologists and breeders of the world. A dozen or more of them had already visited the ruined city of the Exodus, and had seen his grandiloquent notice posted there. Furthermore, the story of the deaths of Mianus and Valendam had been broadcast, whereupon some 30 scientists had climbed into airships of one sort or another, and set off to find Hargreave and to wrest Winters away from him. Had they been unified, in a common purpose of course, they would have had no difficulty whatsoever. But Stakul, from across the ocean, had run across Pilgrim from the west coast, and the two being firm enemies, they set upon each other, and then and there fought it out. As a result, only 28 airships, 3 of them cumbrous living machines, sighted the great form of Hargreave as he strode over the hills. Even as Winters looked, he saw one of the 1,000-foot tentacles strike out at a busy black dot, and presently made out the cloud of attackers against the brightening sky. Benguet was all for making instant retreat, but Winters insisted upon remaining. Suppose we do get another mile to the north. Hargreave can make that up in 15 steps. I want to see this fight. So they remained, Benguet wringing his hands in an agony of fear. The ships seemed to attack one by one. Presently, Winters, to his amazement, observed 3 of them circle away, fighting each other. The spectacle lasted altogether half an hour, and Winters' surprise and horror increased every minute of it. But why? Why don't they get together and all attack at once? Why should they? They want to kill Hargreave, do they not? Only so that they can get you, each for his own set of experiments, I imagine. Suppose they did kill Hargreave, then they would have to kill each other, until only one was left. He would search for you, and would be a gainer by the fight. There could only be one man victorious. How do you know this? Isn't it likely that they want to destroy Hargreave for the sake of public peace? Benguet's eyes opened wide. What ancient nonsense is this? Of course they could not interfere with Hargreave's personal liberty. Once started, where would such a principle stop? Oh, I see. In olden days, people used to have things called laws, didn't they? Really, we aren't quite so primitive as that. And why should they want to kill me in their laboratories? I've come here as an observer from the past. I shall go on into the future in the cause of science. What a mad world this is. Benguet tapped his foot impatiently. Where you get the idea that you're qualified to criticize a world so far above you in development, I cannot imagine. Physically, you are repulsively bestial, with your teeth and your white skin covered with hairs like an ape. Mentally, well, you would never have passed alive out of my breeding jars. What makes you think your cause is so sacred? Chapter 3. Hide and Seek. Winters was silent. Benguet's words were plausible, but he suspected a good deal of what he said was due rather to imaginary than to actual improvements in the human animal during the last 20,000 years. But there was some truth in them, enough to put Winters in a gloomy state of mind. Had he forsaken his own times and his own kind of people, all for the sake of finding himself an unwanted guest in a future world of supermen? And if so, why go on still further into the future? Might the steady progress of evolution not change the face of the earth in the next 5,000 years, make him still more ludicrous in the sight of the still further improved humans who are to come? Benguet was looking at him surlily. All very well, replied Winters stoutly. Suppose you're right. I can still reason sanely. If you're all such supermen, then explain what you're trying to do with life. Benguet shrugged his shoulders. I suppose you have some definite questions? What does Hargreave propose to accomplish? To breed a more intelligent man than now exists. And your chemists? Many things. The heavy elements, radium and beyond, have not yet been produced by transmutation, and thousands are working on that point. Ah, exclaimed Winters, that's more like it. Do they compare notes and help each other in the search? What nonsense is this? Of course no one reveals his work to another. There it is again, of all the stupid, irrational ways of doing things. But what possible motive could there be for such cooperation? Why, to get their job done, and the information broadcast to the world. How stupid! A man is entitled to fame and credit for his own discoveries, not for his ancestors. Well, then, have you artists or musicians? Oh yes, such creatures exist, I suppose, but I'm a scientist and know very little about them. In my day, we'd have called that attitude narrow-minded, but let it pass. It's only in keeping with the rest of things. Now, answer this question if you can. How does it happen so many super-biologists are willing to drop their so important work and fight each other for the possession of an ancient myself? Benguet's eyes widened. You are new blood for their experiments, that's all. Oh, I see. Yes, the biologists would be interested in that. Well, do you have any more childish questions? 1,000. Suppose your scientists succeed in all their tasks. and solve all nature's secrets and breed perfect men, what then? Benguet nodded condescendingly. All our children, sooner or later, ask that question. There just isn't any answer. A man is born free and reaches adult age. Then, for perhaps 40 years, he's free to do what he can. At the end of his allotted span, he must die. The result is, of course, a certain aimlessness, but after all, when a man is dead, that's the end of him. What aim or purpose can there be after death? And so all this fine striving gets us nowhere. For thousands of years, we've been working over the problem of prolonging human life. With good luck, a man can live to be well over 100 years of age, but his mental and physical vigour is gone at 70. Of course, there are the astronomers. Why? What do they do? Their task at present is to study the planets by telescope and by actual observation in rocket ships. A small colony has been established on Mars for the past 2,000 years. Many attempts have been made to colonize Venus, but it's too young a world yet. Poisonous fogs and violent earthquakes are constant, and the hot, steamy atmosphere is unfriendly to human life. But what is the purpose? The Earth will not remain habitable forever. The scientists are preparing for eventualities. Of course, what is really needed is a suitable planet circling a new sun, but the nearest probable star is 2 centuries of rocket travel away, and there again our short lifespan holds us back. However, our astronomers have a definite aim and purpose in life, and, within reason, they exchange information and assist each other. And the rest of the world goes mad, said Winters sadly, killing each other for the sake of a moment's whim, each pursuing his own ends, and no doubt rediscovering again and again what has already been found and forgotten 1,000 years ago. It's a mad world. But we have, each man, his freedom. Winters eyed him quizzically beneath the bushy grey eyebrows, and Benguet remembered Hargreave in sudden panic. We shall separate, he said. Hargreave will pursue us and find us sooner or later. If I can get miles away from you so that he doesn't suspect that I helped you escape, he may not kill me when he finds me. And without a word of apology he turned and set off at a furious pace westward, crashing through the undergrowth as he went. Winters stood there on the hilltop for 10 minutes. He was just turning to make his hopeless way north when he heard from miles away a great crashing sound and observed against the clouds the form of Hargreave. He was evidently making wreckage of the City of Mirrors. Winters started convulsively and set off through the woods as cautiously as he could. It was difficult to be sure of his direction, travelling entirely by the sun. He shuddered to think of what might happen to him if he couldn't find the overgrown ruins for which he was searching. It was hot, and sweat poured off him wetly, and his breath came in tortured gasps, but still he pushed on, an ear alert for sounds of pursuit behind him. Twice he came upon clearings occupied by great living machines, and gave them a wide berth, circling round through the woods. By the middle of the afternoon he was utterly exhausted and sank down to the ground in the shelter of a dense thicket, and fell sound asleep. He estimated that he'd come 15 miles since dawn. He awoke in the middle of the night, chilled and with every muscle aching. He forced himself to eat the food he'd brought, and drank from a flask. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly. Polaris, friend of mariners, beckoned him north as of old, but he remembered that even the stars had changed, and aimed his course part way between the ancient North Star and one of the bright points in the handle of the Great Dipper. It was bad enough walking by day, but at night he found himself unable to better a pace of a mile an hour. So when he came to clearings, he walked in them close to the side of the forest. Hour after hour passed, and trying to recollect the lay of the country around the ruined city, he began to fear he'd lost his way. So he stopped and waited for daylight. At the first light he started forward again, and so came, weary and worn, to the crest of a sharp ridge, clothed with green. On his left, across a broad clearing, were the white masonry and dusty purloins of his goal. Thankfully, he was about to start towards it, when something gave him pause. Music. It came from the other side of the ridge. Cautiously he crept through the woods, and peered out to see one of the living machines a few 100 feet from him. The music had ceased now, and by the early light he made out a dark figure seated in it, busily working over some papers. Curiously he waited, and presently the figure straightened up and pulled something with one hand. Winters always remembered that scene, not only because of its tragic aftermath, but for the sheer breathtaking wonder of sound that ensued. The sun was just lifting above the eastern horizon, and a few brilliant clouds floated above it, like gorgeous galleons sailing in the ocean of sky. The heavy dark leaves of the palms that edged the clearing were motionless, and the hills behind them showed faint and blue. The sound seemed to come from the hills at first, a faint far piping that was answered again close by. Then abruptly a triple crash of sonorous chords sounded, out of which a deep, golden voice began to sob melodiously. The song swelled in tone, and developed its simple phrase into a theme of such tragic melancholy that 100 small voices commenced piping as if in sympathy. Once more the great stunning crash repeated 3 times. Then, with new and sinister meaning, the harmony changed as deep basses lent new force to the old theme. Abruptly the music ceased, unfinished. There was a moment of silence broken by a voice. "You like it?" "Heavenly," the answer was in a woman's voice. "Dulkong has never done anything as good, Valin. But Valin, music is not the only pleasure. Look at me." Winters strained his eyes to see the speakers, and finally made out another form in the machine, half hidden behind the musician. "No, don't pretend you're not interested. You're looking at Afrilla, the most beautiful woman in the world. Why do you turn away your head? Are my cheeks wrinkled? My hands hard to hold? Many men would give their lives to be in your position. Hargreave came out of his fighting tower when I visited him last year, and used my circling arms for his protection during a whole mad week. Don't, Afrilla. You're very beautiful, but I want to work on my music. I can't think properly when you're acting in this way." "Oh, I bother you." "At least I make some impression. I distract you from your work. Music is beautiful, Valin, but have you ever eaten food prepared by Escure? Do you know what it is to drink the liquors invented by Vint, or by that great artist Grumbar? Come with me, and I'll give you all these and more. You'll come back from such an experience with renewed youth and vigour, and will write music greater than you've ever dreamed." Their voices became inaudible, and Winters retreated cautiously, wondering more than ever about this mad world into which he'd arisen. He crossed the narrow ridge under the trees, and looked out at the great figure of Hargreave striding toward him from the west. Like a panic-stricken animal, he scuttled back through the woods and stopped at the other side, heart beating like a trip-hammer and limbs trembling with fear and exhaustion. Presently he could hear the great thudding footsteps approaching, and down from the left strode Hargreave. He stopped suddenly when he caught sight of the living machine. Then the great structure advanced, and the clumsy living machine tried to rise and escape, but a tentacle whipped out and held it motionless, then lifted it slowly halfway up to Hargreave's steel chamber at the top. "Why, it's Hargreave. Is this any way to treat Afrilla?" There was a short silence, then Hargreave's voice boomed out in laughter. "And who is Afrilla's friend?" "You were, not so long ago, Hargreave." "I have no time for memories, woman. Who is he?" As if in answer, a great chord of music sounded, so deep and rich as to set the air trembling and the leaves rustling in the trees. For a startled instant, Winters thought the sky turned brown and felt his limbs tremble. The sound ceased, and he looked to see the tentacle set the machine and its occupants down again, none too gently. Then the tripodal monster set off again northward, heading out of sight. Evidently Afrilla and her musician were badly shaken, for it was 5 minutes before the clumsy machine rose into the air and soared off in panic-stricken flight to the south. Winters tried to imagine the part of the story left unrevealed, and found it hard to picture the life and activity of the human race from the fragments he'd been privileged to observe. The first woman he talked to spoke of sex matters as things for children, yet here was a woman who evidently devoted her life to the art of love-making. And Hargreave, an earnest, almost fanatical biologist, was willing to amuse himself with her. What a jumble of interests, all conflicting, did the world present. Each person followed his particular whim or desire to its ultimate end, with a fine disregard for the interests, even the lives, of all others. And yet, in the midst of anarchy, there seemed to be some orderly progress in this line of research and that. Could it be that anarchy was a desirable thing? Winters, thinking back over the past 20,000 years of human history, decided not. What had happened, he felt, was a cycle in government. There had been far too much control under the brain. Now the pendulum had swung the other way, and there was far too little. Somewhere between the two extremes lay the truth. After a few thousand more years, it would be found and recognized. But his own immediate problem was still unsolved. This world was not for him. He had to get back to his subterranean chamber and await a better one. Yet how could he cross 1/2 mile of dusty plain to see the white ruins that showed against the green forest to the north? Far to the left, the great form of Hargreaves' fighting machine showed like the naked tower of some 20th century suspension bridge. Winters lay in the concealment of the shrubbery and waited impatiently. Hours passed, and Hargreaves still strode about the landscape. It began to look as if he intended to remain until he'd found Winters. And yet, thought Winters, when night falls, surely I can slip down to the plain and cross it unseen. He was growing hungry, but had no food left, nor anything with which to slake his mounting thirst. At dusk he carefully observed his directions, and as soon as darkness set in, he slipped down the hill and started across the level. He'd gone halfway before the searchlight started to play over the plain. The first stab of light coming from Hargreaves' 1,000-foot tower startled Winters almost out of his senses. Should he retreat or keep on? But there was no real choice. He had to reach the ruins. He stumbled forward at a run, and the chill of fear gave his limbs surprising new strength. Hargreaves was approaching now, and the light swept the ground before him in a long swathe. On Winters ran, hoping desperately against hope. Then the light became steadily fixed upon a plain close to the ridge he'd just left, and Winters had a 2-minute period of grace. He could see the first of the ruined walls just ahead of him now, but the searchlight was coming slowly towards him, as if Hargreaves were following something, as he was, for through his telescope he studied the tracks Winters had made just as readily as if he were stooping over them in person. Just as Winters reached the ruins, the light caught up with him. He could not resist a terrified glance over his shoulder at the great white eye that glared balefully out of the darkness, and that grew larger each second as Hargreaves' great strides bore him nearer. With a cry, Winters darted up a side street into the friendly darkness. He knew where he was. He had to reach the other side of the central square. The distance was, perhaps, 200 yards. Should he make straight for it, or should he attempt to hide and slip stealthily, a short dash at a time, as opportunity might serve? When he came to cross the first street, he stopped, for the light lay blindingly upon it. If he crossed, he would guide his pursuer towards his ultimate hiding place. Winters realized he'd not only to reach safety, but to do so unseen, or he would be dug out and made captive again. He slipped into the house on the corner. The door was non-existent, and little more than one room remained intact of the original structure. At the window on the cross street he waited breathlessly. If the light moved away for 2 minutes, he could cross unseen, and there it had gone. Like a flash he climbed over the windowsill and darted across and into the house on the other side. Then the light swept by once more, almost overhead now, and a great crashing told of Hargreaves' huge feet trampling the buildings to the ground. And now began a grim game of hide-and-seek. Hargreaves was evidently determined to smash the entire city to the ground and thus destroy all hiding-places. Winters thought for a breathless moment, and then slipped out from the rear of the house and made his way unseen to the great circular avenue that surrounded the ancient city. If he could only do it in time, he'd be protected from the searchlights, provided he hugged the buildings and ran, panting along, until he came to the section of the city in which Eric's house had stood. The dust of fallen masonry was rising like a white cloud now, which enabled him to make his final dash along a lane and past the very foot of Hargreaves into the doorway he remembered. As he did so, a great crash arose outside, and the front of the house fell out. But Winters was in the back rooms and pressing his foot on the release mechanism, which seemed to take an eternity to operate, though actually only 3 seconds elapsed before the heavy stone flag rose and he could plunge down into the darkness of the stairs. He frantically pulled the lever and breathed a sigh of relief as the stone started to sink down over the entrance. But Hargreaves placed a foot upon the building at that moment, and with it a crash. It sank beneath that ponderous weight and sealed the trembling fugitive beneath the layer of wreckage. For an hour, Hargreaves tramped furiously over the ruins until no stone was left standing upon another in all that city. Then, as if he realized the hopelessness of the task, the light flicked out and the great structure commenced striding southward, the sonorous booming of the great feet growing fainter and fainter in the distance, until the stars looked down upon the quiet night, and the dust settled in a white layer upon everything and gave it a ghostly look. Beneath the city the lights shone in a small chamber. Winters had been hurt by a falling stone and spent half an hour dressing his bruised leg. Then he took food and medicine and slept fitfully for a few hours before he made final preparations for his long hibernation. He closed the great metal door, set the radium clock to arouse him after the passage of 5,000 years, inspected and adjusted the tiny atomic motor that would keep the chamber warm and provide power for the lights that were to awaken him, and took his drug. Then, in the half-hour of consciousness yet remaining to him, Winters opened a heavy book with leaves of thin sheet gold. In this he made the following fragmentary entries of facts gleaned chiefly from Benguet. 15,100 A.D. Perfection of exogenesis. Human embryos successfully developed in test tubes. From here dates the dropping of the last link between mankind and the animal emotions. 17,500 A.D. Test colony set up on Mars, still maintained. 18,000 A.D. Perfection of materials machine. Any chemical substance produced at will from any given raw material. From this period commences, roughly, a general tendency towards the gratification of the individual will or ambition, regardless of consequences, tendency still dominant. History ceases to have significance to the race, a mere recording of individual actions and achievements. 20,000 A.D. Winter's Fourth Awakening. Winters read the words over carefully and sighed at their brevity and the extreme paucity of information available to him. But it was the best he could do, and he closed the book and set it carefully away before he stretched himself out on the couch, adjusted the stimulant tube over his mouth, and plunged the chamber into darkness. While he slept, a slight and fearful Benguet was gazing hungrily from the shelter of the forest upon the breeding establishment of the late Mianus. For a day and night he'd been watching it, and finally, taking bravery from desperation, he had marched boldly up and found it a very biologist's paradise of equipment. Young Bork and Farinda had rather hesitantly handed over control to the elderly stranger. Then Benguet spent a whole hour without once thinking of Hargreaves. Then he remembered and rushed fearfully outdoors and stood a minute listening, but he heard no sound. He shrewdly suspected that Mianus might have been one of Hargreaves' recent victims in the late unpleasantness. But after a week or two he came to look upon the place as his own. He never got over the feeling that his present freedom was a temporary thing, to be ended whenever the inevitable ultimate Hargreaves should sound boomingly over the horizon. Meanwhile, Benguet bred humans and enjoyed himself hugely. Years later, the suspense of waiting for Hargreaves' arrival became unendurable, and he began venturing upon short scouting trips in an airship, but did not happen to come upon his former pupil. Bork, moreover, was becoming difficult to control, and Benguet decided upon a curious course of action. In the back of his head had stuck firmly the words of Winters uttered long ago, "When I awake, Hargreaves will have been dead for thousands of years." So one day he called Bork to him and made him a present of the establishment, leaving at once in his airship. He flew to a secluded valley and set his atomic motor to digging a tunnel and preparing a lead-lined chamber. In the course of a few days, airship and man had disappeared and were never seen again. And thus it came about that two sleepers waited the passing of the centuries until the appointed hour should release them. On the swarthy face of Benguet rested a smile of peace and security, such as he had not experienced in many weary years. There was a hint of triumph in it, too.